little background about myself. I've been making games for 25 years. I've been making games for about 25 years, started when I was 10. For the past 3 years, I've been working, co-founded YetiZen with my business partner. It's an accelerator for game startups in the mobile space, and we're also doing an investment fund in a couple of months to start investing in game startups. And to my left is Mark. You want to introduce yourself?
My name is Mark Visser, and I work for a company called Sauce Labs. Sauce Labs helps companies test functional testing. Helps companies do functional testing. There was a time when application development happened very limited amounts of distribution platforms. If it worked on Windows, that was good enough. But now we offer about 300 plus different platforms to test some.
Do we have batteries for his mic, or can we figure out another mic? Oh, we have another. Why don't we move on to Anusha real quick?
Sure.
Oh. You think there'd be some technical people in the audience? No, he's going to turn the volume.
Am I okay now? Okay. So, whenever you create an application and want to make sure that it works across all the permutations of Android and all the versions of iOS and also all the browser and OS combinations on the desktop and so forth, you can do that with Sauce Labs. And that gives you much more confidence when you release applications. My own background is I worked at companies like Borland and Red Hat, and then now Sauce Labs.
I think you're live.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. Hi. My name is Anusha Sethuraman. I'm in product marketing at Relic, and I focus on our mobile application performance monitoring tool. Relic has been in the APM or application performance management space for about 5 years now. We started with a web APM tool, and then last year we launched a mobile counterpart to that mobile APM tool. Basically for all mobile developers out there, the growing market of mobile developers, and to provide all of you with the visibility that would make you successful in this highly competitive industry.
Hey, Josh Van Tonder. I'm product marketing at Crittercism. And at Crittercism, so we are in the mobile performance management space, and we help developers, product managers, operations manage and get insight into the performance of their apps. So we work with companies like LinkedIn and eBay and Groupon to monitor their apps in the field to understand, across OSs and networks and different carriers, platforms, etc. How well that application is performing, and what the end user experience is. What's the end user experience, and how does that impact your revenue and brand?
Okay, so as moderator of the panel, first thing I'm going to do is ask you a question. Who here is developing explicitly for mobile only? What about web only? A couple hands. What about cross-platform? Does that give you a good idea? Okay. Second question is, who's doing B2B and B2C and other? Okay. The next few questions have to do with that, and we wanted to get a better understanding of what the audience is. So, at a very high level, why is testing a mobile app important? How is that different from testing on, say, the web?
I'll take this one. At Sauce Labs, by the way, we do cross-browser testing as well as app testing, and so we serve both sides of that. A number of things that are different is that for browser testing, the number of permutations, the number of functionality differences across these things is very much lower than in the mobile space. So in the browser space, you're trying to get a consistent experience across all the various permutations, whether it's Windows or the Google browsers and so forth. You want to have the same thing happen. In the mobile space, you have very much more different targets and different behaviors that you actually want to have, and therefore you have a much bigger matrix of things to go test for. When releasing, that becomes a very a hard problem to make sure that you can cover all these various platforms, and that's what we try and make possible.
So you mentioned different behaviors between the different users. Should we test for different types of users? Are there different types of performance tests done for different types of users?
Well, first of all, we are not in the business of performance testing, so I think that's what we should ask from them. But yeah,
it's open to everybody.
So when you say different user behaviors, I think that falls more under usability testing, where you're really looking at how, I mean, iOS and Android users are just so different, just kind of how would they use it. Just yesterday, I was reading this article about an application that this big retail company had built, and they basically just took their website, their mobile site, and put it into an application, and they didn't have something as simple as a back button, which everyone just sort of takes for granted on a mobile application, and that gave them a really low score from a user perspective. So really from a behavior perspective, I think just thinking about usability is one of the most important things. But just from testing in general, I think and how different mobile is from web, I think that the ecosystem itself is just so fragmented. It's iOS, yes, I mean it's a little bit less fragmented, but Android is just so fragmented. You have so many different devices, operating systems. I think it just results in so many different combinations. Also the fact that the user is always mobile, they're either switching from Wi-Fi to carrier to going under a tunnel or whatever it might be. So just thinking about all those different aspects, I think is important.
Yeah, to piggyback off that, I mean, I think the point's really been made here about the fragmentation. That's one of the core issues that separates the web world from the mobile world. And to put that in perspective, if you look at the number of devices out there, you're talking plus or minus 3,000 devices that you have to consider across the major platforms. On the OSs, when you consider the point releases and the major releases, you go out over 100 different releases to consider. When you're talking about the carriers themselves, you've got about 700 plus around the world that you have to consider. And you sort of go down the path of all the different aspects, whether it's the number of cloud services that you're using, etc. They all together create sort of an infinite set of permutations that you need to be considering for your app once it's out in the wild. And that's fundamentally where a lot of the complexity comes in. That's in this space that we're I think all of you are trying to grapple with to deliver a great end user experience. So the second question was about more about personas, and one thing that we've seen done a lot is thinking about the particular transactions that are associated with particular personas that are being used. So it's often the case that you might be instrumenting a particular checkout transaction, so across multiple screens, or a sign-up transaction, or a referral. I'm using transaction somewhat loosely here, but something that has a business meaning to your app. And those are the kinds of business metrics transactions that you would want to be focusing on during your test, both pre and post-launch. And those transactions usually map, one or more of them map to different personas. So that's the way we often see it done.
One more thing that I've seen at Sauce Labs a lot is that in the browser testing, in the traditional testing, the target was very clear, but nowadays with mobile apps, you have mobile apps that open a car, or you have mobile apps that project onto your television screens and so forth. And so these are the kind of scenarios that if we provide testing infrastructure, it's much harder to do, because it's so much about the context, where the thing is, the voice commands, the location, all these kind of things make for an enormous amount of test scenarios that we never had to cover in the browser world. So that's a big difference.
So each of you mentioned a different type of testing in your introduction. Where in the product lifecycle does that fit best?
So I think that testing generally has to happen, at least a minimum amount of testing has to happen before you release the first version of your product. But there is this concept of crowdsourced testing that's happening a lot now, and I think that is really advantageous as well, just to put out a beta version of your application and get multiple different users to just give you their own feedback. You have real, as low as that number is, but it's still real users trying to use your application. So that's testing before you actually really launch your app, but I think there is that missing piece where it's really hard for a developer to write all these scripts and imagine all these different scenarios that are possibly going to occur when a real user is using your application, right? It's difficult to create these test scenarios of what normal is to real users when your app is out in the wild. And I think that is where something like a performance testing tool where you're getting real user information fills that piece of the puzzle.
More to add?
Yeah, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here, but I totally lost it, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. It's probably the fire engines going on outside threw you off. What is the difference between testing and monitoring performance? Is there a difference in your opinion, and what's...
I'll take that one. And by the way, just got it back on the other thing too, so let me do that first. Where it belongs, because there is this tendency of talking about left shift. If you take the application lifecycle from idea to development to at the end to the right is deployment and production, then where we fit at least is very much on the left, where the developer is testing and submitting tests along with his code to make sure that it works before it ever gets into the wild. The biggest thing that we see now is that companies that succeed in making their cycles, the turnaround from going from development to production and back, shorter, can do testing on every part of it, and that's really important. So that if you discover something in the wild, like you were describing here, it's only acceptable if you can then fix it immediately, not 3 months later, right, when the next release happens and so forth. So fast cycle time is a really important part of accomplishing quality. So.
Did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. The one thing I think there's a lot of complementary aspects to sort of testing tools and the performance. And the one thing that we've seen occur a lot is being able to write sort of automated tests along, being able to write those and deploy them pre-production to ensure a good level of stability before you get out the gate. Is the first step. One thing that can happen is sort of the reverse information to help you focus on what you need to focus on. So what we've seen happen is once you are using a tool that gives you the visibility in the field, that helps identify certain issues that particular segments of your user population are experiencing. Once you've identified those, once you're back in the dev QA mode, it helps to isolate the particular testing scenarios that you want to write and bake into your frameworks for more of the automated stuff. So we do see a fair bit of that, the information from the field informing what happens during your QA, both roadmap as well as the testing cycles.
Okay. Specifically when it comes to testing app performance, what's the most important thing to consider?
So I would say, and I think at New Relic we really believe that real user monitoring is what is the most important part of trying to get how performance is affecting your application and in real time, right? So if someone is using your application right now and they're having this, they're going through an interaction in your application and there's a 30-second time frame that interaction takes to happen, how do you know if, maybe you never imagined that kind of a scenario when you were actually testing that on this particular device, this particular carrier, this particular version of my application, this is how my app is performing and that's how it's affecting the users using maybe too much memory on that particular device, which is resulting in so much of a time frame. I think we really believe that real user monitoring is the key to really making your app successful and understanding user experience.
Yeah, so this comes back to the difference between testing and monitoring. Where testing is probably the best way to make that distinction is test is a particular scenario that you devise and then the outcome is either yes or no whether this thing works, whereas monitoring is where the real users are actively on your app and you analyze their behavior and see what works and what doesn't work and so forth. Very often the result of the monitoring is like there are certain scenarios that just don't work very well, they need to be improved. You now start creating tests so that upstream, where the developers are at work, they can validate that it performs these tasks well before the next release comes back into production. So I don't know any of our customers, and we have many, that do not use, in addition to our stuff, the monitoring tools from my colleagues here.
Good, there's love all around. So this one gets into a little bit nitty-gritty details, but when I'm looking at crash reports, how do I prioritize those items?
Yeah, so I guess that comes to me. So Crittercism has two major parts: crash and service monitoring. The crash monitoring aspect, the thing that is really critical is determining, which of the various crashes are impacting the most number of users in the most critical way, right? I mean, that's fundamentally what you're looking for, is some measure of prioritization. And most often, the first data point that you would want around crashes is what percentage of my user base is experiencing that. And then the drill down from that is, where in the app are they experiencing that? Is it a critical transaction or not? And then you'd like to have information that helps you troubleshoot that, right? To what extent is it a particular carrier, platform, location? All of these aspects come into play. So step one from the prioritization standpoint is a measure of the number of affected users. Typically, you want to measure as a percentage of your user base. And that's important because if you just look at the raw number, you don't necessarily know, is it the case that my app the user base is growing or shrinking? What is the number of crashes relative to that? Is it better or worse than my last release? So it's ideal if you can use a few different data points, but one is the number of, the percentage of users that are being affected over time.
So, there we go. Running a games accelerator, I get submissions almost on a daily basis, and the number of times that I've had games crash on me and I've just deleted them without a second thought, I can't even count on both my hands. How often does performance affect engagement? And how do you see those metrics when you're watching that on the back end?
I can take that. So just to add to his thing a little bit, I feel like apps crash, and that's one of the things that a lot of developers think about today when they're thinking about app performance. But if you think about it, any sort of well-built application will probably crash maybe 1 to 2% of the time. So I think there is that whole other 98% of the time, what is your app doing, right? If your screen is just freezing and it doesn't really crash, you're not going to get a crash report for that. So that's that aspect is still really new, I think, to the whole to app developers, just thinking about going beyond crash reporting and looking at the full stack of what's happening at the client side, server side, all that good stuff. But what was your question again?
It was, how does the app performance affect engagement?
So we've seen a lot of studies and results that just show how user performance is one of the key things that users think about when they think about your application and your experience. If a screen on your app is going to take 2 or more seconds to load, you've probably lost their interest already. Just if they constantly see the loading button, probably not going to look at your app at all. I think that we've come across some studies that say users will tend to leave bad reviews for your application probably more than 80% of the time. And one of the main things that they want you to do that would redeem your app in their eyes is if you can fix the problem really quickly. And performance monitoring helps that stuff.
Okay. So who here has less than 1 million users on their apps? Okay. Now keep your hands raised. You have less than 1 million users. Now keep your hand raised if you want to get more than 10 million users eventually. Okay. Now keep your hand raised if you feel prepared for that on the performance side. Wow. Okay. A couple hands left. See. So, how do you feel you can best prepare a user for that huge influx of scalability on the performance side, and what impact does that scalability have on the back end of those apps?
So, like I was saying, the whole fragmented ecosystem in mobile is something that you really need to take into account when you're thinking about scalability, because you're going to have so many different devices, so many different carriers, so many different locations in the world trying to use your app, and getting insight into how your app is performing in one part of the world on one particular device, seeing if that is the most popular device that your app, most users of your app are using. Say the iPhone 5S is the most popular device that you've noticed from all this data, but then you also notice that the response time or the interaction time for these, for backend services that interact with your iPhone 5S is crossing a warning limit that you have set, maybe over 10 seconds. Then you actually have the data to go and solve problems like that. So that is one example. So to think about other examples, if you have ads implemented in your application, and obviously a lot of apps tend to have ads implemented in their application, right? How do you know whether an ad is probably blocking the main UI from displaying something to the user 50% of the time? How do you know something like that? Is there something that you can do to optimize that and push that into some other task that would not block the UI thread? So things like that are the kinds of things that metrics that you're going to get insight into when you use a real-time performance tool.
We were called in by the Obamacare initiative when healthcare.gov crashed royally, and it took for a long time before it came above water, essentially, right? They had no concept whatsoever of what would happen. And so thinking in terms of performance about this is not just an issue of if you get more users, you go slower. It just stops working at all. And so it took about 10 different major initiatives to change the behavior of the backend there so that it could deal with performance, which was in the end a matter of they had never thought of that. And so if you're, these were the things of databases totally stopped working and so forth. So if you want to be ready for the 10 million, you better start thinking about the scenarios of what could happen. And like the big thing for that one was to create a sort of wait room. So if people started coming in excess of the number of people that they could deal with, they needed to be put in a queue and so forth. So it's an architecture thing as much as knowing what's going on. But you better monitor this, and few people know it.
That's a good example of just how testing and performance sort of go hand in hand, because New Relic was heavily involved in the healthcare.gov fixing the site, right? So it goes hand in hand, just thinking about both testing and performance at the same time.
So, I don't want to get too political. I used Obamacare recently, but speaking of horror stories, can you share some experiences that you've seen with developers? And you don't have to mention names if you're not allowed to or don't want to, but can you tell us some horror stories just to scare these people into using performance metrics?
Okay, I have one example. We worked with a banking client, obviously I'm not going to take any names, but so they obviously work with multiple different APIs that service different clients in different locations, etc. And they experienced an error where their clients just could not access data in their application, in their mobile application. So developers started playing this guessing game. So is it the API? Is it the backend API? Is it the database? Is it the server? Is it the Wi-Fi? Is it the LTE network or the 3G network? Whatever it is. They just started playing this guessing game. It took 4 weeks to try and figure out what the problem is. And then they finally installed with New Relic. You would have known in probably like 5 minutes that it was this one particular location in California, the API that California was using, that was constantly returning a 403 error, right? So not having insight, just look at the time difference. 4 weeks versus in the banking world, yeah, it's insane.
Yeah, a couple examples. One, sort of a major retailer that we worked with thought they had a very high-performing mobile app that end consumers were doing transactions on. They later discovered after installing performance management tools that for 30 minutes of the day during a relatively key portion of where transactions would occur, only from mobile, they were losing a half hour of all transactions, and they had zero visibility into that. And I think that's the kind of thing that is the core issue I think a lot of devs are struggling with is lack of visibility and being forced into a reactionary mode. And so being able to leverage tools that put the ball in your court in a way, right? I mean, how do you monitor endpoints that are key? A second aspect that we've seen relates to, say, geographic specific issues. We had a customer house that was entering into China, and they discovered that a large set of all their interactions, their web service calls were failing because of the Great Wall of China. We had a separate customer that discovered that a lot of it's a carrier network, and they discovered that the couriers were unable to do a lot of the engagement. So they have a mobile phone, they run around and they deliver things on the ground. And they discovered in New York, the carrier that most of their couriers were using didn't work. It didn't have good reception. So they had to force everybody over. I won't get into the game, but nonetheless, you need something that gives you a little bit of visibility in the field for that sort of thing. That puts the ball back in your court a little bit as a developer.
You have a horror story?
I'll add one.
Besides Obamacare?
An e-commerce firm that got no transactions out of Wyoming, so this is not performance-based, and again, this is functional testing in our world, but they just had coding errors in what states they could accept, and it took them a long while to find out that they thought there was just no popularity for their products in Wyoming. It turned out coding errors that could have been very easily avoided, and it just one test fixed that situation.
I don't think my mic's working. How much time do we have left? All right, well, I'm just gonna, oh, here we go. I'm gonna open up to the audience after just one more quick question to these guys. Aside from the tools that you represent standing up here, are there any other tools in your tool bag you would recommend to developers?
Yeah.
I don't mean competitors, but simple things they can do themselves to help solve.
I mean, there's a gradient, right? I think there are a number of free tools. I think a number of us have free tiers that you can get started with to at least start getting that kind of visibility. The other thing I'll mention is it's not always an either or, right? I mean, you will see that.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I would expect the developer to have a handful of tools that they can monitor.
So who here uses Selenium or Appium for functional testing?
I see two hands.
There's a long way to go here. Anyway, people use security scanning tools, code scanning tools to make sure that there is no security risk that they are introducing. Across the whole spectrum of testing and performance, there's a large number of tools that people use.
Okay.
We see everybody having portfolios there.
There are like some, if you want to do some, try to address this fragmentation prior to actually launching your app, there are services that provide they have different devices located in different regions, different carriers, so they have that you can rent and use, so that's something that you could consider prior.
I've seen a few that have a whole suite of devices in a lab in different clouds around the globe.
Right.
It's kind of interesting. All right, well, let's open up to the audience. You said you had a question?
Yeah, as it relates to testing and monitoring, I heard Josh say recommends while in development, you should be actually doing your testing right along with actually doing your development.
So the question is, do you do testing during development?
I'm trying to remember what we were talking about. I think what I was getting at was more about how to feed intelligence into your development cycle to help you focus where you're going to fix issues. So an example, one of our customers is DocuSign, and they, what's that? And so one of the things that they do is they get issues that are reported through the performance management tool, and they have a dedicated story for every single release that they have, where the developers know that a portion of the bug fixes and the testing that will be associated with it, just pull straight from the top highest priority issues that are in the tool every single sprint, right? They have one story dedicated to that. I think the end benefit is you have very fast feedback loops that help support faster releases. I mean, I think tools like ours, really one of the key things is helping you get time to market faster by bringing the intelligence back in. And it's not uncommon to see people go from 2 to 3 plus months to 2, 3, 4 weeks release cycles, just because you have more insight into what's actually going as soon as your release gets out there, right?
There was a question in the very back I want to take, and then I'll take it next. Go ahead. I'll repeat it. So.
Okay. My name is Raghu. I'm chairperson for ARCLA Application Quality Alliance, which is an IEEE standards organization. Going back to your previous question, we actually provide tools and test cases to all developers. Most of our developers come from mobile applications, but there are other things as well.
So IEEE here, it says that they provide tools for developers. Is
tools
that
and test cases.
Tools and test cases for developers.
And we host actually all the applications that actually pass our criteria. We have a quality directory that we go and say, hey, this is the standard, this is passed.
And if you guys aren't familiar with IEEE, get familiar with it. So is there a question tied to this?
There is a question tied to this. I have hard talk about performance testing and a little bit stability testing. What do you recommend for network resource utilization, current drain? These are the things normally developers don't think about while they're developing their
network utilization. What tools do you recommend there?
In the United States.
In the U.S.
So when you say network, are you talking about like
how much data your app is actually utilizing? And is that
right?
as little as possible?
The amount of data that the app is utilizing.
New Relic actually provides insight into that kind of stuff. So how much data are you transferring in a particular API, what is, or different APIs, what sort of data transfer do they have? So we do actually provide that data.
How about current drain?
So New Relic is the answer.
Current drain.
Battery, you
Yeah.
mean? So we don't specifically give insight, like in the sense, say memory could drain battery sometimes. That's a possibility, but we don't have that yet.
Okay, there was a question over here. I want to move quickly to. Sure. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
Well, I'll keep it brief then.
Yeah.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, I think that's part of what these kinds of tools do, is they give you insight into the data I/O of the app across the types of services you're using and down to the endpoint level. They also monitor the error rates or the latencies associated with those services across the different platforms. And most of these tools provide the capability to slice and dice that by a number of dimensions: the OS, the type of carrier it's on, and then when you see particular issues, there's usually some sort of snapshot that's given. So in cases where you're running into issues, there's a snapshot that provides information about the devices. So it helps you identify, was this a memory issue on that device at the time that this type of issue occurred? As I mentioned, what kind of OS and carriers, etc. So there's some level of insight into that provided from a performance management system.
And then a question over here.
Thank you. I want to know what is the right number of users to work with to run initial tests? And
Okay, what's the right number of users to begin your initial tests? And there's a follow-up.
Is it 50, 100?
Basically,
And what are, in your experience, the main reasons for apps to crash?
so two questions, completely separate. What's the minimum number of users to begin testing? Secondly, what are the major causes for crashes?
So, I mean,
You might hear a diversity of answers on that second one.
just from experience, I would think 50 users is a good number to start with to run a beta test, and probably going up to like 200 or something and I would try to diversify the kinds of users you're getting, just because you want to probably have different locations, different cultural users to understand from a usability perspective. So I think 50 is a good number to start with, for sure.
Any other stabs at that one?
I mean, I'll answer it from the perspective of how Crittercism runs our own product development. So keep in mind, I think it depends on your audience. So we sell to enterprises, and typically, during our beta programs, we'll start with closed beta where we invite people, and there'll be, a dozen people gives us pretty good insights if they're, give you an open door to get information. So typically, we try to pull people in that are part of sort of a premier beta program that help give us really unfettered feedback on what's working and what's not. I think it's a little different if you're a B2B2C type market, but at least for us, you're sort of in that 10 to 20 range is what we find manageable to get really detailed feedback during beta cycles.
And then the last part of it is, what are the most major causes for crashes?
There's not a straight answer to that one. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
it's all over the map. I mean, we'll often see spikes associated with market events, right? I mean, if there's a new OS release coming out, it's not uncommon to see changes. And our theory on that is frankly, devs go where the users are. So until there's a big base on those platforms that warrants a ton of attention for fixing issues, you'll see differences in crash rates. And that's the same general idea we see across tablets as well, right? Devs will focus where the eyeballs are first. And so that's how you see the prioritization of effort and therefore the benchmark crash rates across the industry.
So in closing, there's no easy answer to that one. And if we take up any more time, we're going to have a lot of angry, hungry developers on our hands. We've gone into lunch. So thank you very much.